Yeah.
when it's a big national election. So that means books that might have other years would have been published in late October. They just schedule those books up earlier. Even like Isabel Wilkerson's, we were talking about, her book was published in early August. That might not normally have been the case. They're trying to spread those out. And then some of the books were delayed because of the pandemic from May, June to September. So it's sort of this kind of sandwich coming from both directions. Yeah.
It's going to be.
Some of the books were ordered last spring and finally going to show up, and others we have to hurry up and order because they said, oh, that order got canceled. So trying to figure all that out. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'll be tough. Tough for the writers too.
Oh, yeah. I mean, both established writers, but also debut writers, really, to get, they're the kind of, and it's really hard because there's so many books literally you want to, I mean, you're both writers with your novels, and sorry, you actually want to, you see someone walk in and go, and you see what else they're looking at, and you said, I've got something else to show you, or their eye might go to it that they didn't know about, and it's on the table there, and or if you talk a little, because you do talk to people, and then you say, oh, have you read this? She has a new one out, that was with last year. It was a lot of fun to do that. So
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we try it, we do it. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah.
Salar, is this the first thing you've done with the new book?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We have to celebrate that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the launch. Oh my goodness. Salar, congratulations.
Thank you, Maaza. Thank you.
This
And
is
the book
great.
isn't out yet, actually.
But they did a nice thing for us. They made sure we had them.
When
I mean, I
is
literally, probably because of that kind of delayed order, I probably only ordered it about 2.5 weeks ago. It was like, okay, we better hurry up and do this. Suddenly it's August, and doing this or it was maybe late July, but it was like, whoa, we got to hurry up. Like,
this is a new experience.
Yeah.
I'm doing a launch before the book is actually launched.
We can call it a preview.
Yeah.
Preview.
Oh, that's a good way. When is the book?
In 10 days, right, Ibrahim?
September 1st.
Ooh,
right,
then
right around
we're the exclusive here.
So, okay, good. Oh, this is smart, actually. This is very good because, September will be busy, so this is good.
Yeah.
Well, if all three of you are ready, I guess we'll maybe sort of slide into doing what the actual program will be.
Okay.
And because then I'll talk a little bit and then I'll get out of the way. And Ibrahim, I may come back at the very end after you've kind of wound it up just to thank everyone. But we're not going to talk about the ending anymore. We're going to talk about the beginning here and to say welcome to everyone on behalf of everyone at Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle. Wherever you are, we're glad you're joining us. It's still late afternoon here in Seattle, but the three people you're going to be hearing from are all on the East Coast. So for them, it's a nice part of the evening. And so wherever you are, we hope you're doing okay in terms of the times of day and what's going on where you are. We are delighted. I think this evening began the idea of it with the idea of celebrating a wonderful new anthology that Akashic Books, which is a Brooklyn-based publisher, which has been doing extraordinary literary books over the years. And one aspect of what they've done, you'll probably hear more about this in the evening, the whole group of it, because it's now numbers over 100 titles, is an anthologies of noir writing that are set in cities across the United States and now all over the world. And in having Maaza Mengiste, who will talk about her other work, but she's the editor of this newly published anthology, Addis Ababa Noir, her home city in Ethiopia. That was a little bit of how this began. And then Johnny Temple, the publisher, said, but wait a minute, we have this amazing novel we're also publishing right now. Why not bring both together? Because the writer Salar Abdoh, who's visible to you now, who we've never had the pleasure yet of presenting. We have been able to do so with Maaza. But this brand new novel, this literally is, it's not even out yet, except we have a few copies because it's due to be published in 10 days. But this book out of Mesopotamia, set in his home country of Iran, some of it also in Iraq and Syria, the conflict there, the ongoing wars and conflicts there. But also to say Salar is the author of 3 other novels, and also edited Tehran Noir. So there may be part of this that moves into that. But what you'll hear tonight will be each of them doing a little bit of reading of their books, and then some questions and conversation, which will be led by somebody who has worked with both of them. Ibrahim Ahmad is the lead editorial director of Akashic Books. And we were chatting before, he's been there 20 years. So he's been there through the whole evolution of the press, including the Noir series. So he can speak to much of what has animated each of these writers' books, and where all they'll go. I do want to say one other thing about Maaza, who came to Seattle 10 years ago for her debut novel, Beneath the Lion's Gaze. Last year saw publication of her second novel, a much awaited one, and I'm going to hold up the advanced copy, because that's what's here at my place, of The Shadow King, which also has warfare in it, as does Salar's novel. This book, set in Ethiopia, literally is at sort of the eve of World War II with Italian invasion, is an amazing book, and on a celebratory note, has been longlisted for this year's Man Booker Prize. So that we are hoping and rooting for, and we'll keep watching and wishing good hopes for that as that goes along. So there's ways to ask questions through the chat mode, and Ibrahim will monitor that and pose your questions to both Maaza and Salar. And with that, I will disappear in visual and oral ways and turn this over to Ibrahim. But to say thank all of you who are attending this, and to now welcome Maaza Mengiste and Salar Abdoh. Thank you both, all three.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
Rick, and also to Karen and all the staff at Elliott Bay. It's really, as someone who's been involved in publishing for 2 decades, if I have one takeaway for my experience in this business, is that independent booksellers are the lifeblood of what we do, and we're greatly appreciative for Elliott Bay hosting this program. And I would encourage everybody tuning in this evening to order a book from their website tonight. Elliott Bay is also open now daily for in-store shopping, and I believe they're still doing curbside appointments, but they are shipping books all around the country for free via media mail. Please, even if it's not one of the books we're discussing tonight, I really implore everybody to buy in. And we need venues like Elliott Bay to persist and to keep their doors open, and to allow us this rare and sanctified space to be able to talk about books and literature. So I'm going to try my very best to stay out of the way this evening. I'm really eager to hear from both of our presenters, and it's really been a privilege for me to be able to work both with Maaza and Salar over the years on their respective works. And, the newest books that we're discussing this evening include Addis Ababa Noir, which Rick was just speaking of. It's, in fact, so fresh that I haven't yet received my copies of it from the office. And likewise, Out of Mesopotamia, Salar's new novel, I'm awaiting my delivery any day now. But so I'm the editorial director at Akashic, and we're an independent press based in New York City. We've been around for a couple of decades. And back in 2004, we decided that we wanted to showcase the vibrancy of the writing coming out of our home borough of Brooklyn, New York. It was just a rich moment for literature, and rather than simply producing an anthology of new Brooklyn voices, it seemed that there was the potential to do something a little more interesting and a little more special. And the local Brooklyn novelist Tim McLaughlin came to Akashic and said, have you ever thought about gathering noir writing, crime fiction writing from the borough, new stories, fresh stories. And almost on a whim, we published this first book, Brooklyn Noir, without having much expectation as to how it might, take hold. And here we are 16 years later now publishing Addis Ababa Noir, which is the 105th book in the noir series. And I'm really, proud of the noir books that we've published. We published Tehran Noir several years ago, which Salar edited for Akashic. And I'm really curious, Maaza, just to get things rolling, about the fundamental challenge involved in curating an anthology of noir writing in a place that isn't Los Angeles and that doesn't have a clearly defined noir tradition. What was that process like, and how does one even begin to tackle that?
Uh-oh. Did Ibrahim freeze, or is it just me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, so we're still going. I'm assuming that maybe I know what the question is, so I will answer it and hope that he comes on. If Karen can just text in the chat and let us know if you can hear. Are we frozen?
No, we're good.
We're good, and
Yeah.
we're screening still. Okay, so okay, I will answer his question. I will assume that everyone can hear me. And Ibrahim was asking about the process of how to describe a noir to an audience that is not. There's Ibrahim. Ibrahim, I'm answering your question, even though you didn't get a chance to finish, but I think I know where it's going. I think noir was interesting in Ethiopia. The writing, that genre is not very well known. And so one of the things that really the only direction that I gave the writers was to say that these are not stories that have a moral at the end. This is not stories to teach people. There's no moral, there's no like, this is how you should live your life at the end. And most of these endings are dark, or there's something that's happened that is, it's not happy. Nobody ends a noir story cheerful and very glad to have been through the experience that they went through. And that was the general direction I gave. And what came back was really interesting because if you look at the collection, you'll see there's a prevalence of ghosts, stories that feature ghosts or the supernatural, but really ghosts, the dead, in one way or another. And then you have the other side, which is the revolution was also part of this, and several stories featured that, which makes me think that what is noir but the disappeared, which is very much a genre that could be Ethiopian. These stories of people who suddenly disappear because of the revolution, or they disappear because they're refugees and they are somewhere along the Sahara or in the Mediterranean, or they finally make it to Europe or somewhere, and then they are gone. And he said Ethiopia is full of stories of disappearances. And he began with that, and then and started writing his story. And this is Adam Retta, who has his story in there is just amazing. But it's interesting to think about, that's how he conceived of it, that these disappearances which makes sense when we think of the ghosts that seem to come up again and again. And then the revolution, which is about, of course, people disappearing in one way or another. And these stories made this noir genre their own. And I thought that was wonderful.
And Salar, I'm curious as well in your curation of Tehran noir, and in fact, let me take a step back. In all of the noir series volumes, there's never an overt intent for these books to be political in nature, overtly political in nature. Yet that aspect of perhaps noir fiction being a useful conduit for, I don't know, what the social novel was to the 19th century or early 20th century, like Dickens and Jane Eyre. There's the opportunity through, through this form to really turn the mirror back on society. And I'm curious, before we get into your novel, in your experience with curating the Tehran volume, did you sort of anticipate that the sort of the politics that are always in the backdrop would seep into the literature in the way that they do?
Great question. There's no help. I was sure this would happen, and I just finished reading Maaza's Addis anthology, and as I was reading it, section by section and story by story, there are many dissimilarities, but there's also many similarities, because these are geographies where enormous upheavals have taken place, and there's been war, there's been revolution, and there's been the dispossessed, and those who left, and those who remained behind, and the few winners, and it was really, after having done Tehran Noir, about 5 years ago, we finished it, to go back and to read what Maaza had done with the authors. It really gave me chills, because it brought me back to certain places and I had to work with these authors, some of whom had very difficult times, and I had to, on several occasions, I really had to pull the story out of them. I had to say on several occasions, I know, everything, you're living in a place where you're used to, for instance, censorship. Censorship is a part of everyday literary activity over there. And then, so what happens with censorship is that after a while you become pretty adept at it, and you self-censor, because you don't want to deal with I've done that myself actually over there, so I know how that is, the progress slowly towards that, where you just become actually your most, you're like a shadow over yourself, let alone other people. So in order to bring those people out of that was a very difficult task, because for instance, Maaza talked about a lot of ghosts and stuff, which is one thing. But here with Tehran Noir, and I made sure it didn't happen with Tehran Noir, was that a lot of these authors had learned to skirt the censor by being vague, or being, going down the path of surrealism. And I would have to keep telling them, that's not what we want here. We're trying to do something else. So once I pulled these stories out, without a doubt, politics and the past, like if you look at the first section, where also Maaza has her piece, it's all about, the past and the present sort of coming together, and the overriding overarching theme of that is politics and what that has done to people.
I'm really struck by the almost the unlikely parallels between Ethiopia and Iran in so many ways. You know, both nations are these historically rich, vibrant, cosmopolitan places with tremendous histories, and you know, historically have really resisted the kind of colonial experiment that has afflicted so many of their neighbors in their respective regions. So it seems like you know, you know, it's almost, there's this strange kind of simpatico feeling between the two volumes, both in terms of the approach that the authors take, but also in the way that, for example, the, you know, both countries had to deal with tumultuous decades in the 1970s that resulted in you know, both incredibly violent events, but also ones where the legacy of history and I think the long tail of historical memory is something that really ties these two countries together. The fact that the history is never really in the past, and I think people's memories as well of historical events impact the psyche in ways that you know, they might not in other countries. And I'd just be curious, Maaza, I know this has been a preoccupation of yours, is the notion of the way that you know, the historical memory informs the present moment. And I'm curious if you know, in your own story in this volume, for example, if you could speak to you know, both you know, what your story is about, and also whether you know, these elements are sort of supporting the essence of the narrative that you've presented.
Yeah, you know, I think it's really, it's interesting to think about the, you know, when my first book came out, and that book is set in the 70s during the revolution in Ethiopia, there would be people in the audience from Tehran. And I would get a few people afterwards coming to me and saying that what I just spoke about was exactly what happened in Tehran. And it was interesting to think of the parallels between the two countries, you know, around the same time. My story that I have in this is about a group of Argentinian forensic scientists in the 90s who go to Ethiopia to begin to excavate some sites where there were mass graves in order to collect evidence for a trial against members of the military junta in Ethiopia. They were about to be put on trial. Those forensic scientists really did exist. They really did go to Ethiopia. They really were gathering bones and different kinds of evidence for scientific evidence against these interrogators and other people within the regime. And I also know that you know, Argentina had their dirty war, and it was around the same time that Ethiopia was going through its revolution, and also around the same time that Tehran was going through its upheaval. So it's, you know, you have these constellations of you know, devastation and horror happening around the world at in this similar period. And the question I've always wondered, and I still wonder this, is what happens afterwards? You know, how much do people carry with them? Which is what you were also talking about, Salar. You know, this idea that something can end, but memory basically ensures that it's never truly over. And so how much do we carry with us, and how do we learn to carry that and cope? And how does that come out and manifest itself in the present? So the story, I really wanted to deal with these forensic scientists, you know, in Ethiopia, and someone from that group befriends an Ethiopian man who is basically waiting and looking for them to dig up the bones of his son who disappeared during the revolution. And it felt to me like I wanted to write about what actually remains in the end. What do we have of people if we don't have them with us? And is the thing that we don't have of them perhaps more real than what they would have been, you know, if they were with us? All these questions. So the story was one way for me to begin to start dealing with the questions I had.
Could you oblige us by perhaps just reading a short portion of that story? So
yes, definitely. And
Great.
for the first time ever, I'm going to read it on screen. I have my book here, but let's try this so that I'm not looking down and I'm looking at the camera. So I'm going to read a short part, and it will begin towards the end of this section where I have a character who is Argentinian. His name is Alfonso, and he was a prisoner in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, during the Dirty Wars. But one of the things that he had to do was photograph other prisoners just before they were executed. And he survived because of his talent. And then I will go into Gideon's section right after that, who is the Ethiopian man looking for his son. And this is just a short section. The team of forensic scientists had come from Argentina with skills honed in their own land, among the bones of their own people. They had come to excavate mass graves in Addis Ababa and prove what former Derg officials tried to deny. The team had been to other places, Kurdistan, the Balkans, El Mozote, and Croatia, before Ethiopia. They understood the power that the dead still hold. They worked under the belief that witnesses, documents, even photographs could deceive, but a restored skull, a bone fragment, a skeleton dug up from a hole filled with the remains of dozens of others, spoke a kind of truth for which there was no defense. And Alfonso, he'd come to Ethiopia because he wanted to stand in front of these remains and pretend the bones could substitute for the Argentine prisoners who understood what they were really looking at when they turned to face his camera. I know how to photograph the dead, he'd said to Lara during the interview. We know each other. She had finally relented. What's the singer's name? He asked the waitress now, blinking rapidly to keep the tears back. It still surprised him how easily he cried since his release from prison. He pointed to the door behind him as if the man were still standing there. Gideon, the waitress said. Once, he had a son. She shook her head sadly. Part 2. Walking back to his home near the crowded Mercato, Gideon didn't know what to make of the Faranjoch sitting in his favorite bar talking to Konjit. Seeing these foreigners had startled him so much he'd drunk his beer in 3 gulps. Maybe Konjit had put on the music for the tourist benefit. Maybe it was her way of asking why he hadn't come to visit her in a week. Maybe it was her way of punishing him. So many people in Addis Ababa found small ways to make him pay for what he'd done in the past. Jabbing him with a sharp elbow in a crowd, kicking him in the leg, shrinking away from him as if he were a leper. He understood the language spoken in these moments, expected it. Some days when he thought of his son, he wished for it. But the song, Tizita, had come like a sharp, bitter slap. The unexpectedness of Alahun Gassasa's soaring voice in the dark Tajbet had been like a fist to his chest. It had been his own closing song whenever he had performed at the palace in the days before the Derg. Samson, he would have called out if he'd had a voice. The shock of hearing that song had been that strong. he would have called out his son's name. And in the country where he still had his voice, he would have still had his son. And his son would have come running, Samson, my son, Ababa. And I'll stop there.
That was incredibly powerful. Thank you, Maaza, for sharing
Thank
that. I'm, you know, I remain struck by, you know, the notion of documenting acts as a way to, you know, both bear witness to them, acts of savagery in the way that, you know, so much of the horror that took place under the Derg was captured on video or on film or on photographs. And this also, I think, is, you know, this is an area that you cover in the Shadow King as well, where, you know, you have an Italian photographer who is documenting, who is taking photos of people as they're being thrown off the cliffs and murdered. And I'm curious about the nature of representation and what it means for an outsider to be documenting, you know, this, you know, the bones that are being excavated, and what, you know, what tension lies in there when it's somebody else who is putting that, you know, putting that out there for the rest of the world.
I've wondered that, you know, you mean you like these forensic scientists going into Ethiopia to do this, you know, because they actually existed, and the story was inspired by this group. But the story, this photographer, was in part inspired by an actual prisoner in the Naval Academy School, which was a torture center in Buenos Aires. He was forced to photograph prisoners as well. He happened to sneak out rolls of film, pretty much like my character Alfonso, and this is how so many families understood what had happened to their children. So these two entities actually existed, both the man and the scientist. I just put them together. And I, you know, but I found the head forensic scientist, a woman, as I was getting ready to write this story. I had been doing research on them. I located her. She was in New York City at the time, in Brooklyn. And I just said, I would like to talk to you about what this experience was like. And it was, I found out through some of the information she could tell me that they had been to other countries as well. So I'd always imagined these people who had grown up, came of age during the dirty wars in Argentina, might have had their own family members disappeared, who might have been inspired by what happened to become forensic scientists, then travel around the world to do this. And so I imagined that if they were in Ethiopia, there's a kinship that they would feel with people, because they would understand that kind of loss. It's a special language that not many people would understand, I think. And so I imagined Alfonso and Gideon, who eventually do interact in one way or another. They interact at the bar. At some point, even if, you know, Gideon doesn't speak Spanish and Alfonso doesn't speak Amharic, there is something that they understand, and it crosses languages and crosses borders. And really, you know, they belong to a different country, a different territory that's united by loss and memory. So I imagine that this is how they would be. I know from conversations I've had with anyone who is an immigrant, or anyone who has any memory of being in a homeland that has conflict, that there is a rapport. There is something that people understand of each other. And I imagine that this is also the case for these characters.
I think this is a really good segue into talking about Salar's novel. Yeah. Just for context, Salar has spent much of the last half decade in Iraq and in fighting ISIS, and is, to my mind, one of the very finest pieces of literature, not just from the region, but I would say, if any, any form. And I'm firstly curious, Salar, if you could speak to in the same way that Alfonso the photographer is documenting the crimes of the past there in the trenches in Iraq and Syria. All of the fighters have mobile phones on their persons and are in real time documenting the goings on. Can you speak to a moment about both the absurdity of the moment, but also what you were able to glean by the way in which we even experience war? I mean, in many ways, the war that we're experiencing is sort of bifurcated and virtual because we're being beamed in these images that that very few people otherwise have access to.
Yeah, I have so much to say about what Maaza talked about, but I will go to your question because there's so many things there. Anyway, about out of Mesopotamia, again, the similarities between our works in our respective novels, again, is the whole nature of photography and documentation. That also struck me. In the case of Out of Mesopotamia, you have a journalist, and he is in a part of, wars are covered pretty well these days, but this guy, as I did, he goes with these groups that are not covered very well, at least by the Western media. And then, nevertheless, he sees that no matter where you are, it seems, on this planet, there's a Facebook, and then he talks about how, all of the Iraqis that I was with in the front lines, at any given moment, before battle, after battle, during battle, they were Facebooking and taking pictures. And the guy, the main character, talks about how sometimes they would post something and it would start to make its life in whatever social media it was put out in, and while they were getting killed. And that was a real, for me, to witness that firsthand up close was a real revelation of, we talk about how, everything is virtual, but I actually saw it. And then there's a moment where the character thinks, we're in this place. And, some of these landscapes are absolutely horrendous. I mean, where there's no living thing, no structure stands. And yet, that in a couple of years, he talks about that. He says, we're really simulations. In a couple of years, some tourists are going to be here, and maybe Lonely Planet or something will put out a book about, if you want, special adventures in dangerous places, come to northern Iraq. So when I was there, I thought about that, and it was with me all the time. And because I've worked with journalists and photographers, and I've worked with some really great guys, some war photographers and journalists, and some that you feel like, they're just sort of, this is fodder for their own thing. And so the hero of the novel, who is part of this system, this corrupt system of recording. Uh, he is both, that's his livelihood, but at the same time, he's disgusted by it, and that push and pull. I mean, if you look at Maaza's short story or her novel, I mean, that sense of, you know, being part of something, a system where you're both good and evil, right? You know, that's so that really was, and with this war, and I think all the wars henceforth, it's going to be. I took a long way around to come back to uh, this notion of, you know, photography and everything being recorded. It's just there's an element of true absurdity about it, that, you know, you're literally perhaps no more than 100 meters from the guy who is you know, calling the thing he calls, and he does want to cut your head off. That's what he wants to do, and he says that to you in so many words every night on loudspeakers. And yet at the same time, you know, you're sitting here with men who are singing poems, or, you know, sending Facebook posts, if there's, you know, that sliver of internet, which you can get nowadays. Like the main character again talks about, he couldn't, when he was in Iraq, his Iraqi SIM card wasn't working because they were on the battlefield, but his Iranian SIM card was working. So, you know, and that happened to me many times. And, you know, I did stupid things. I would be calling a friend in the middle of some pitched battle, you know, and then something would happen. And yeah, I did silly things like all of these other gentlemen around me. So that element of being a simulation to being in it's being very dangerous, and at the same time being as if, you know, as if you're truly in one of these video games that kids play. It's an absurdity that's a part of us, of our 21st century existence, I guess. And
So
yeah.
I do want to dwell on one thing that you just raised, but before I do so, I will encourage anyone tuning in to enter any questions into the chat. We'd be happy to take questions from the audience. But Salar, you know, this notion of you know, the people who are actually in the trenches. Tell us about the fighters, because it seems to me that it's, you know, on the one side you have, you know, the ISIS fighters who, you know, their core belief appears to be some form of nihilism, and on the other side you have a, you know, a pretty eclectic assortment of people, including some very unlikely alliances of people fighting on what is ostensibly the same side. Can you speak to just, you know, who's on which side? Because sometimes it's unclear who your enemy even is.
Right. I mean, good question. First of all, ISIS, for instance, it wasn't just one entity as well. They were from all over. They were from Chechnya. They were from North Africa, and even lower in Africa. They were certainly from all over Europe. So it was eclectic, and you know, having been there and been in these situations, first of all, I want to just, you know, say that, you know, a lot of people just sort of, and I know Maaza has something to say about this too, a lot of people just get pulled. They just become victims, not to excuse them, and I'm talking about ISIS, who wanted to, you know, chop my head off, but, you know, like a lot of people just get pulled into these situations. They're young, they don't know what the hell they're doing. It's forces of history. Maybe you're living in, you know, Mosul, you know, you've seen corruption and injustice from that other group, and somebody comes and says, well, join us and then we will save the day and give you a paycheck every month. You know, so there was that, you know, so I don't want, even though, you know, they were, quote, my enemy, I don't want to make them into some general evil entity, which I saw a lot of it. I saw a lot of that, but I think I would like to think about individuals. But on the side of the people who were opposing ISIS, it was a real soup of various people. So one of the situations was you had the Shiite militias, which I was with, many of them supported by Iranian Revolutionary Guards, actually fighting on the same side with the Americans. So there was American air power there, and really, I don't think Iraq would have held without Iranian boots on the ground, and so it was a really strange situation. And then a little bit later on, when you know, Mr. Trump decided to just across the board call all of these people who had essentially fought on the same side terrorists, it was like a real kick in the stomach, you know. And I think there was a moment that I wrote in that essay that's, you know, you edited and it's going to get published. I talk about how there was a moment when President Obama and Iran came together and signed that deal, where everybody, including in Iraq and Iran and other places, thought there was an opportunity to actually have a grand rapprochement, and of course that went out the window. But in times of war, yes, there are always moments when, you know, the enemy of your enemy is your friend and all of that. And that also creates all kinds of absurd situations, and people who are just adventurers, people who want to, you know, like, there's all kinds of things. I could go on, but I'll stop.
Maaza, do you care to weigh in on that last point before I ask Salar to read a little bit?
I mean, the only thing, I completely understand what he's saying. I mean, the fact that conflict makes very strange bedfellows. And once you start breaking apart this monolith and start looking at people individually, then it's a whole different world. It's something, there's always something new to discover there, which is what I think the novel, as a novelist, as both of us working in these, you know, within this arena, it makes it so interesting to examine, because it's complicated, as complicated as human beings are. But the one thing I would like to say is the thing that I noted in Out of Mesopotamia was Salar was talking about the absurdity of this. There's so many absurdities that happen in these situations where, you know, it's like you're in a pressure cooker and everything that happens is magnified. But the humor that's also in Out of Mesopotamia was something that I noticed. That absurdist, that eye, Salar, you have such a sharp eye for the absurd, and you would bring it up. And as horrifying as the situation was, you know, that the characters moved through, there was also this dark, macabre, but also just funny humor, this thing that would come through, and I found that really refreshing. So you did manage to bring out that aspect of it as well in the story.
Thank you. The only other thing I want to add, because I saw it all over, you know, both in Maaza's short story and also in her novel, The Shadow King, and also in Out of Mesopotamia, my own book, is that, you know, it's really easy to make judgments from far away. But when you're inside a situation, and she describes it perfectly, a pressure cooker, you know, in Out of Mesopotamia, for instance, she, um, the hero has to, you know, on a couple of occasions, he's given, he's sort of pushed to, you know, take somebody out, and he doesn't do that, but nevertheless, he's friends and comrades with people who do that. And I was thinking, you know, there is a moment in Maaza's truly magisterial work, a work of art. I urge everybody to read The Shadow King. Towards the end of it, where I just had to stop. I had goosebumps. I have them now again. You know, when Hirut, I'm not sure if I, you know, she is, you know, she is sort of sort of, I think, killing Kidana, right? Like in a way, she's not like, you know, none of these people are completely, you know, what she's doing is holding him like he's dying, but she sort of makes sure, correct me if I'm wrong, that he actually, you know,
I can't give away anything.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. But you know, like you know, all of that, like, you know, and also the, you know, the photographer in The Shadow King, the photographer in the short story, you know, these are people who carry a lot of baggage. And also in Out of Saleh, the main character, uh, he also carries baggage. He also carries baggage. He's also a journalist, a writer, and, you know, he talks about some of the BS in that world, and so sort of juxtaposes it, you know, uh, to the opportunism that happens in war. And, you know, and then he sort of comes to a conclusion that it's all just one big soup again of, you know, like corruption in a way, with moments of absolute beauty and goodness that happen, particularly in war, where just there's a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood and camaraderie that is, you know, it's rare. It happens outside of that, but that pressure cooker that Maaza talks about really sort of speeds everything up. I'll stop on that.
And forgive me for cutting out again. I don't know why this never happens in my staff meetings, but only happens when I'm, you know, being recorded. In any case, Salar, can we impinge upon you to read a short something?
Certainly. I chose this very brief section because well, it gives a sense of what the landscapes of war look like and how it really feels. And, you know, what goes through one's head when one's doing this. But I also wanted to read from this particular section, again, as a tribute to Maaza's book, because there's a section again towards the end. I'm not giving anything away this time, but the main character sort of lists all of these people who, some of them who are not there anymore, many of them. And this is sort of what happens here. The only other thing I will explain about here is that you will, the word mokab, a mokab is a place where warriors, soldiers come to sort of rest and eat and sleep. So we'll run into that word towards the end. So these are, you know, they've been through a lot, and these are just men going down, you know, northern Iraq to do a job, to do an operation, and this is the main character talking. The countryside was a flat nothingness, Occasionally, on parallel dirt roads, a dot moved and we didn't know if the thing was ours or not. Nothing was taken for granted in victory because victory had been here before, and it always managed to slip away like fish or happiness. We drove in 3 trucks, hardened men who breathed retribution and the diesel stench of war and loved it. I sat in the front next to the cleric, taking in the murderous smoke of cigarettes that only he and I seemed not to care for. The vehicles putrid with a staleness that is indescribable. If I survived, I would live out my life remembering hours such as this, when breathing seemed pointless. My eyes tried and failed to catch the distances where a drone, a plane, a gunship, an enemy suicide truck, a friendly, or really any motherfucker at all who could spook you out of your own melancholy might suddenly emerge. But my eyes were lemons, God-given failures that mostly just guessed at the things men spoke of when they pointed into distances and felt for the placement of their weapons. Names. Everywhere there were names, so many combatants and hangers-on and lost souls treading the dying misfortune of Mesopotamia, that one got lost in the maze of titles and martyrs and those waiting in line. I had developed the fear of returning to the places where war was at a respite or was non-existent. Though dangerous, Tel Abdoh was still a few kilometers too far away from the action. I would rather go back to our mokab and wait for the enemy to strike again. It would have been suicide on their part to hit us once more, but suicide was their stuff of life. And somehow I held the unreasonable faith that if only I stayed at the mokab long enough, all the dead would return as if they were ghosts on a catwalk.
That's incredible. That's just beautiful. Out of Mesopotamia comes out on September 1st. Addis Ababa Noir is available now for purchase from Elliott Bay. Tehran Noir, which I do have a copy of, is also available. We also published Salar's previous novel, Tehran at Twilight. Just an incredible bounty of literature contained here. And again, I will implore everyone to consider purchasing books tonight from Elliott Bay. In our remaining moments, I would again ask if the audience has any questions. If not, I do have a couple of final things I'm curious to get your take on. But I'll give a moment for anyone to type in questions. One thing I was struck by in your description of the sort of extraterrestrial landscape, and really throughout your novel, Salar, is the absence of Americans. It's a very curious thing, particularly when you think of where we are today. It's very difficult to even keep right in one's mind that at the beginning of January, it seemed like war with Iran was on our doorstep in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. And, having just returned from Tehran, I'm curious to just get your take. What are people talking about on the ground? What does it feel? I mean, in some ways it feels like the war is already here, in terms of this Cold War between Iran and the US has been flaring up as a hot war from time to time periodically. But I'm just curious to get your read on how people are feeling generally.
That's a very complex question, but I'll answer it this way. I'll answer a part of it. First of all, to go back to the first part of your this paragraph, the Americans obviously are there in the ISIS war. and the hero himself mentions that they would sort of pass each other silently in the afternoon, sort of invisible to each other. And in a way, that has been Iran and America's attitude, at least the facade, and then with moments of extreme violence. What Maaza said in the beginning of our talk is about memory and the long hand of memory. What happens in places like Iran and Ethiopia is that, first of all, bad blood, just like not forget, not forgiving and not forgetting is a big problem. So that what happens is, for instance, you will be in a place like Iran, or the people, Iranians who are outside of Iran, against regime, pro regime, whatever. Everybody has their own attitude about what they want to happen. And I'm the guy who has been in the region, have seen what war and devastation can do. So I'm always trying to argue, trying to convey to people that war is really, really an absolutely horrible thing. You don't want that to come to your doorstep. And one of the things that really, bothered me, one of the things that, again, is one of the emblems of 21st century war is like, within a few hours, you can be from the front line to being in Tehran, sipping on your cappuccino. And every time that happened to me, or I would, take a plane from northern Iraq, come to JFK, catch a cab, go to City College and teach a graduate fiction workshop, So, there's that discombobulation, but, and I felt, when it was with Tehran vis-a-vis Iraq and Syria, I felt this anger that, I've been in situations where, literally 30 kilometers away, people are devastated and starving, and here it's as if nothing is happening. And it's really hard to make people understand how horrible horror is, how horrible, like starvation is, not having a home or a roof over your head is, So in Iran, or Iranian, activists or those in the opposition, they have their own attitudes about what they want. Those who are pro-regime, they have their own attitudes about what they want. And my own take is that, let's try to do what, for instance, President Obama and his administration and President Rouhani tried. But a lot of people don't want that because, people have had their own experiences, and you can't tell them to just forget it. It's hard for people to forget some of the things that happened to them. And so there's a multiplicity, to answer your question. There's a multiplicity of attitudes, but the most salient one is just fear. Fear coupled with the immediate scarcity that exists because of economic sanctions. Suddenly, your friends can't get their medicines, or the price of meat suddenly is 20-fold more expensive, and things like that. So it's a multiplicity of things that happen.
I'm going to aspire to end on a hopeful note.
Was I that awful?
No. I mean, this is, in fact, your response does give me a measure of optimism, and obviously, the geopolitics are something that are obviously going to be in a state of flux for some months. But one thing I'm struck by in, picking up the Addis anthology is, that despite the odds and despite the horror and the experiences that, you know, even some of the writers in the collection have gone through, there is this imperative to both bear witness but also tell stories, and it does seem that there is a great richness of contemporary voices coming out of Addis today, and many of the writers are younger, but then you have some more established authors like Adam. I'm curious if you could speak for a moment, and I know that you've been such a terrific champion of you know, fellow Ethiopian writers over the years. I want to know who is giving you hope these days, which voices, and also, you know, if you could speak to just what seems to be a real richness, a treasure trove of voices today operating both, you know, on the ground in Ethiopia, but also across the diaspora.
That a siren just went by, so I had to mute myself briefly. But I think that in terms of the voices that I'm most excited about now, a lot of them, they're in the Addis Ababa Noir, which is, you know, this is what I think is so exciting about this collection. There are writers who live in Ethiopia who are writing in Ethiopia, who are in the collection, and then these voices from the diaspora that are in there. If I don't even know if I could name all of them, but if you take the book and just, you know, you look at the front, and we couldn't even put all the writers that we wanted to. We were limited, but every single one of these writers is doing something exciting. I think that the next challenge is going to be how to bring these voices out even further. You know, some of these people, some of these writers have several books. How can we get a larger audience for them? You know, Gurma Fantaye has written 4 books in Amharic, and it's, you know, sometimes it's a question of translation. Adam Retta has written many books. He's a well-known name. It's just agents, publishers, you know, here they are. You know, call Ibrahim, bother Johnny Temple. But they're here, and I'm really excited about that. But, you know, within the writers that are, I think, are going to be publishing very soon, Michaela Waka, Meron Hadero, Rebecca Fisaha, Matam Shifarao, who's an amazing poet, and now she's working on a novel. Lalissa Gurma is, you know, already has a short story that's been published in Johannesburg Review. So these writers are here, and I'm excited about what will happen next for them. Suleiman Adonia is here. He's published 2 novels already.
He has a new novel coming out from a U.S. publisher, which is
right here. I was just about to. I was about to wave it. Because Maaza's words are on top. It just coming out. Gray, and another independent press, Grey Wolf, is doing this
Grey
book.
Wolf, yeah. So
but I was about to. Yeah. And he's in the anthology. Yes.
Yes, and he's based in Brussels. I want publishers to be aware of these writers, because they are so gifted, and their stories are really unique. So if there's hope, Ibrahim, which there is always hope, it's in literature. I think it's in what literature can remind us again of why we are here, and why we continue to seek each other and seek communities.
Well said.
As we were wrapping up, and I see that one question did arrive into the chat, and Maaza, I'm going to address this to you briefly, and then we can let everybody go into the quiet night. But from Makda Teshome says, and forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, how important is language when constructing a story? Do you ever feel the need to translate a word written in your native language into English for the reader to understand? And Salar, perhaps as a translator, you also might want to weigh in on this. But Maaza, if you want to take a crack at
yeah, I mean, I think language is very important. There are some things in Amharic that cannot really be translated easily into English. And I just had a recent conversation with a translator of mine. She's translating from English into Italian. And she had this word. She said, "Can you explain what gursha is?" Everyone who speaks Amharic will understand what gursha is, but there's no real English word for it. It's a gesture of feeding a guest with your own hand. You give them food. It's at the end of a meal, so they're already full. You've given them food, and you've treated them as an honored guest, but here's the last bite that you must have. And gursha is the host feeding the guest in an act of honor. And it's always the biggest bite. So there's a moment in my book where this happens, and the translator said, "What's the Italian word?" I said, "There is no Italian word unless you'd want to describe the whole ceremony, but the sentence is very short." And I said, "You just have to leave it and let it go." There's just some things that don't really get translated well. This is, one quick example. And I think in that it's okay for readers not to know everything. I know when I was learning English, I didn't understand everything, but I still read. And it's fine if readers step into a world that's not quite their own, and they have to pick their way through it once in a while, because the characters live in that world, but these readers are, they're, in a sense, they're eavesdroppers into that space. And I don't think everything has to be translated.
I agree.
Maybe as a translator, you have a different.
No, I totally agree. And I also ditto what Maaza says about, I've made it a part of my life's work to try to translate, Iranian or Afghanistani writers writing from Persian. There's only so much we can do, but I feel like that is something I have to do for these people and get them published in various places. But what Maaza says about, sometimes you just have to leave it alone about translation. There's things just are not going to come through. But as a translator, I try to, it's interesting. It's like a puzzle. It's like a chess game. You try to find another path, perhaps not to say the exact same thing, but to get that message across. And it always works out in the end. You always manage it.
All right. Well, I think wrapping up a program with "it always works out in the end" is probably the way to do it.
Maybe not with poetry. Maybe.
Rick, do you want to?
Okay, I'll take over.
Send us off.
I just want to. There's not too much to be said. Salar and Maaza have both given us so much, and Maaza's image of feeding with the own hand. I think we all feel wonderfully fed by what both of you have done, and actually, I'll extend all sorts of thanks to Ibrahim for all the kind words said about Elliott Bay, the store, and about independent bookstores, and about getting books, which are both Maaza and Salar's are at Elliott Bay. And we actually do have a Salar's novel here a few days ahead of time. But I also want to point out, I didn't say enough about Akashic, which also publishers such as Akashic play this role. And I was reminded of this partly because in holding up Suleiman Adonia's new novel, and with Maaza's quotes on the front of the cover, I was looking at the front cover of the advanced copy of The Shadow King, and the quote there is from Marlon James. Marlon James could not find a publisher who's now a Booker Prize winning author himself and is well published in terms of what happens financially and every other way. but he couldn't find a publisher in his country, and Akashic was the publisher that published his work, and so Akashic has played that role and plays that role in making sure writers whose work isn't always represented, for whatever reason, but the kind of gatekeeping that sometimes goes on, Akashic has done this work in a vital and essential way. So kudos to Ibrahim and Johnny and everyone else at Akashic. With that, again, the only hard part is we don't get to all go mingle afterwards and sign books, sign the brand new Addis Ababa Noir and the brand new Out of Mesopotamia, and convene and go somewhere and have something to eat and drink afterwards. Another time for that, but well, to everyone that's been with us, Maaza, Salar, Ibrahim, and all of you online to us, we thank you and bid you well. I feel like I was saying stay safe before Barack Obama was at the end of these saying stay safe as a sort of a leading off, but do take care and good health and good reading too. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Rick. Thank you
Thanks.
for having us.
you.
Thank you,
Yes.
Ibrahim. Salar, thank you.
Thank you, Ibrahim.
Take care,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye-bye. Thanks,
Karen,
everyone.
bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.